Into Batan swarmed some 80,000 combat troops accompanied by 26,000 civilians. The hasty retreat resulted in severe shortages of all basic essentials. There was food enough for 100,000 men for 30 days. Therefore, if a lengthy defense was to be made, food rationing would have to be introduced. Quinine was also in short supply. This magnified a problem that had already wreaked havoc on the defenders, malaria. Batan is a peninsula 25 miles long and 20 miles across at its widest point. Down its length, like a spinal cord, run two mountain ranges with peaks rising over 4,500 feet, covered with thick jungle. Between the twin mountain ranges is a narrow valley inundated by streams. Narrow coastal plains are found on both coasts. For the defense of Batan, MacArthur split his forces into two corps. The First Corps under Wainwright was responsible for the left side of Batan, with Parker's Second Corps on the right. On Batan's southern tip, a service command was formed and manned with two divisions. The terrain of Batan favoured the defenders. By utilising its natural contours, MacArthur was able to form solid lines of defence across the length of the peninsula. The first main line ran from Mauban to Abukai. 6 miles in the rear was a reserve line. Further south was a line along the Mariveles Mountains, Batan's highest peaks. Integral to the entire defence was the island of Corregidor, which served not only as a supply base, but dominated the entrance to Manila Bay. Morale was high among the men. This stemmed from a false rumour that massive reinforcements were en route from America. Success, the defenders believed, was simply a matter of holding on until these reinforcements arrived. And what better place to hold on was there than Batan? Homer hoped that he would be able to take Batan quickly. Japanese intelligence estimated that he was opposed by only 25,000 defenders. In reality, the Japanese forces faced more than 3 times that amount. On January 9th, at 15 o'clock, the Japanese attack on Batan commenced with an intensive artillery barrage on the Second Corps front. Following the barrage, the Japanese infantry moved forward. They were surprised by the fury of the counter-barrage put up by the defenders. Although the infantry made some progress that day, it was only because they had not reached the main defensive positions. On the 10th, MacArthur and his chief of staff crossed from Corregidor to view the situation firsthand. This was his only visit to the beleaguered troops during the entire campaign and lasted a mere 5 minutes. Without question, his absence from the front lines was out of character for the man. Why he remained closeted on Corregidor instead of visiting the troops is a mystery. The troops began to call him Dugout Doug. One critic has said, if MacArthur's motto had been to lead from the front in the First World War, his reputation was that of one who led from the rear and deserted in the face of the enemy when the chips were down at Batan. The Dugout Doug tag would remain with him all the way to Korea. A derogatory song originated there on Batan and remained in vogue for years afterward. The lyrics were sung to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Dugout Doug MacArthur lies a-shaking on the rock. Safe from all the bombers and from any sudden shock, Dugout Doug is eating of the best food on Batan, and his troops go starving on. Some historians have speculated that it was his acute embarrassment at having promised reinforcements that he was unable to deliver that caused MacArthur to shun the front lines. Whatever the reason, his action was unquestionably a serious mistake. It demonstrated a marked lack of respect for the caliber of men doggedly fighting under him. How could they blame him if help was not forthcoming? In fact, they probably would have felt a closer bond with the man had he shown himself more often and convinced them that he shared their plight. He could have still continued to cling to hope of reinforcements in order to maintain morale, but his presence would have given the men even more, a leader in whom they had faith and who cared about their welfare. If only they knew just how much MacArthur really did care, it might have ended the derogatory comments. On the night of January 10th, the Japanese struck the main line of defence. At midnight, they began a nightmarish banzai attack with one wave after another surging forward. The fighting was desperate, at times hand-to-hand. By dawn, the attack was over, but both sides had suffered heavy casualties. To Homer, the failure of the attack was a bitter pill to swallow since he was certain that the enemy line would fold. As a consequence, he painfully concluded that the capture of Batan was not going to be as easy as originally anticipated. For the next few days, the Japanese regrouped and licked their wounds. On the 13th, they tried again. This time, they directed their attacks towards Abukai. The Philippine 21st Division successfully halted this offensive before it was even launched. Then Parker asked for reinforcements, which came as no surprise. MacArthur sent the Philippine Division, one of the finest units in the army, to reinforce the inland flank, the weakest spot in the entire defensive line. On the 16th, Parker attempted to surprise the Japanese by counterattacking. The enemy anticipated the move and resisted fiercely. Once Parker's attack failed, the Japanese swung over to the attack. The 9th Regiment hit the inner flank of the Philippine 51st Division and made such significant gains that it threatened to envelop the entire 2nd Corps. On the 22nd, Sutherland arrived on Batan to get a first-hand appreciation of the situation. After meeting with Parker and Wainwright, he realized that the Abukai-Moban line would have to be abandoned, and the troops pulled back to a new position that already existed south of the Bagak-Pilar Road. MacArthur approved the maneuver and reported the latest setback in a pessimistic dispatch to Washington. Unlike the withdrawal into Batan, however, the latest retreat was disorderly. The operation took 2 days with the Japanese in hot pursuit all the way. The rear guards were hard-pressed to buy the necessary time for the retreating forces. On the 25th, Japanese aircraft bombed and strafed the troops, causing many casualties. By that evening, the troops of the 2nd Corps were settled in their new positions. Thus far, the Japanese had been made to pay dearly. Since January 9th, the 65th Brigade had incurred 1,472 casualties out of a force of 6,651. The brigade commander, General Nara, wrote on January 25th that his brigade had reached the extreme stage of exhaustion. Homer suggested to his commanders that in order to disperse the American and Philippine forces, landings along the west coast of Batan might be attempted. Major General Naoki Kimura of the 16th Division therefore decided to attempt landings at 3 points behind the 1st Corps front. The first attempt was made on the 22nd with the 2nd Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment. Kimura's plan called for his force to leave Moron and land at Kaibobo Point. Lack of accurate maps and heavy seas caused this force to miss their landfall. They became divided into 2 groups. One landed at Longoskawayan Point, 10 miles south of its destination, while the other landed at Quinawan Point. But the landings were made against undefended beaches. As they moved inland from their beachhead, the story was different. Stiff opposition forced them to fall back to the beach and set up a defensive perimeter. On the night of the 26th, the Japanese attempted to send reinforcements from Olongapo to Quinawan Point. This party also missed their landing point and came ashore 200 yards short of their objective. On February 1st, another larger force was sent to the Quinawan beachhead. This force was sighted while still aboard their landing craft. 4 remaining American P-40 fighters began a deadly attack on the invasion force and caused them to retreat. On the whole, the amphibious operations did not accomplish their intended purpose, but instead caused the Japanese to suffer heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the defenders had established themselves in a new defensive line that ran from Orion on the east coast to Bagak on the west, with Mount Samat in the center. Despite all types of shortages, the morale of the troops remained high. Every Japanese attack thus far had been repulsed, with the attacker incurring heavy losses. General Nara was not ready to be undone and ordered his troops to continue the offensive. Then, on February 8th, he was ordered by Homer to stop all preparations and to stand by for new orders. The defenders of Batan, the battling men of Batan, as they were called, had done a brilliant job of stopping the Japanese attack. The poorly trained Filipinos and hungry, battle-fatigued Americans had foiled Homer's chances for a swift victory. The defenders, however, were suffering from a variety of problems, shortage of food being the greatest. They were reduced to eating dogs, monkeys, bamboo shoots, roots, iguanas, and python eggs. Disease was a major concern. Because of the rapid evacuation to Batan, very few mosquito nets were brought along. Coupled with the shortage of precious quinine, malaria reached epidemic proportions. On Corregidor, MacArthur found himself dealing with more problems other than the military situation. With him on the Rock was President Quezon. He was constantly criticizing America's apparent abandonment of the Philippines and applied pressure on MacArthur to prod Washington into a positive response. For his part, the general hoped to use the prestige of the Philippine president to elicit more aid from America. The world situation, however, boded ill for the Philippine forces, as United States' commitment to the Rainbow Five plan placed emphasis on the European situation. Meanwhile, Homma was under a great deal of pressure to complete the campaign. General Sugiyama directed him to clear the peninsula rapidly and threatened to remove Homma from command if the task were not accomplished in short order. On February 8th, a great blow struck Homma in the form of a message from Imperial headquarters. His chief of staff found him at his desk in tears, holding a copy of the message stating that the emperor was very concerned at his lack of progress. This was the most humiliating thing a Japanese officer could hear. Homma knew, however, that it was Sugiyama who had sent the message, using the emperor's name. It was only this knowledge that prevented Homma from committing suicide. The message was Sugiyama's way of covering up his own strategic blunder that had directed Homma to concentrate on the capture of Manila instead of slamming shut the gates to Batan. Once a stalemate was reached, Sugiyama was eager to pass the buck. Poor Homma was the scapegoat. In response to the message, Homma dictated a letter to Imperial headquarters, questioning the wisdom of continuing the attack on Batan. Sugiyama burst into a fit of rage upon receiving the letter. He immediately called a meeting of the General Staff and urged Homma's recall. The members of the General Staff argued against such a rash decision, and the meeting ended in a compromise. Homma would remain in command, but his Chief of Staff would be replaced. To fill this position, Sugiyama was directed to appoint a more aggressive man, Major General Takagi Wachi, a close personal friend. In addition, Homma's antagonist appointed Colonel Masanobu Tsuji to the General's staff. Tsuji was a noted fanatic, responsible for numerous atrocities in China and Malaya. In spite of everything, Homma could see one ray of hope on the horizon. Reinforcements were also dispatched. When they reached the Philippines, however, Homma looked aghast at them. The units were made up of total misfits who were poorly trained and equipped. Once more, Homma vented his rage at the man who was out to sabotage his career. Nevertheless, preparations proceeded. On February 20th, MacArthur was able to overcome a potential disaster, that of Quezon falling into enemy hands. The President, his wife, and Vice President Osmeña were taken aboard a submarine and transported to Australia. By now, General Marshall was also worried about losing his Far East commander. MacArthur was much too experienced an officer to sacrifice. Not only had he proved that he knew how to fight the Japanese, he had become a national hero in America. To lose him might result in serious repercussions. It would give the Japanese an enormous psychological victory if they managed to capture or eliminate MacArthur. The general had to be saved, and Roosevelt agreed. For many weeks prior, Roosevelt had been under pressure from various special groups and influential people clamoring for the general's safe return. The press, the Republican Party, and even Sir Winston Churchill, to name but a few, begged for MacArthur's evacuation to Australia, where he could mollify the frightened Australians who feared a Japanese invasion of their own country. MacArthur was visibly shaken when he received the presidential message ordering his evacuation to Australia. He had no desire to leave his men, but then again, as a dedicated soldier, he had no wish to disobey the president's direct order. Consequently, the general threatened to resign and return to Batan as a common soldier, but his staff convinced him that the only reason he was being sent to Australia was to lead a relief expedition back to the Philippines. After weighing all factors, MacArthur realized that the staff's arguments made sense. Every indication pointed to Australia being built up as the base for a great counter-offensive. Accordingly, MacArthur agreed to the order, but cabled Roosevelt a few conditions. He informed the president that he would go only if he were allowed to select the right psychological moment to leave, lest a total collapse occur. Roosevelt and Marshall concurred. The days passed, and MacArthur still showed no inclination of leaving. Roosevelt sent another message on March 6th, insisting on the general's swift departure. 3 days later, yet another reminder was sent. In fact, MacArthur had already made up his mind to leave and needed no further prodding. The problem was how to successfully accomplish a breakout through the Japanese naval blockade. Naval officers on Corregidor gave him a 1 in 5 chance of successfully eluding the enemy patrols. As a vehicle of escape, MacArthur finally selected patrol torpedo boats and set March 11th for his departure. As the date drew nearer, MacArthur summoned General Wainwright to his office and invested in him the command of all forces on Luzon until he could return. Then MacArthur said, "Jonathan, I want you to understand my problem very plainly. I am leaving for Australia pursuant to repeated orders of the President. Things have gotten to such a point that I must comply with these orders or get out of the army. I want you to make it known throughout all elements of your command that I am leaving over my repeated protests." MacArthur concluded by ordering Wainwright to hold out. Wainwright responded, "I told him that holding Batan was our aim in life." Actually, MacArthur intended to coordinate the defense of the Philippines from Australia. He made it clear that Wainwright was to command on Luzon only, and then only under his personal direction. In this way, MacArthur felt that even if Batan and Corregidor fell, the balance of the country could continue fighting. Unfortunately, he never communicated the command structure to Washington. Later, the Japanese assumed that Wainwright was the overall commander with authority to surrender all the islands if it came to that. The story of MacArthur's escape from Corregidor is an epic in itself. John Buckley, the young commander of the patrol torpedo boat flotilla, was a swashbuckling sort of commander, just the type suited for so daring a mission. Once at sea, danger lurked over every horizon. On more than one occasion, the small flotilla came within a few feet of being discovered by Japanese destroyers. In addition, they were nearly sighted by Japanese coastal artillery batteries, the huge guns of which could easily blast the general, his wife, child, and staff to smithereens. Finally, on Friday, March 13th, the group reached Cagayan on the island of Mindanao, 35 hours and 560 miles from Corregidor. From there, the party boarded B-17s for the final leg of the journey to Australia. Immediately upon reaching his destination, MacArthur made his now famous statement, "I came through and I shall return." Meanwhile, the Japanese had received welcome reinforcements in the way of heavy artillery. These guns were quickly trained on Corregidor. The troops on Batan, though hungry, disease-ridden and besieged, still managed to keep their morale up. In fact, MacArthur's departure was looked upon by some as a sign of hope rather than hopelessness. The general, they felt, would not let them down and would return with a relief force. Wainwright's first action upon assuming command was to change the name of his forces from United States Forces, Far East, to United States Forces in the Philippines. At the same time, he appointed Brigadier General Edward King to act as his representative on Batan. The latest defense line on Batan stretched between Orion and Bagak. It was 13 miles long and manned by the 1st Corps under General Jones, with a total of 32,000 men, and the 28,000 men of Parker's 2nd Corps. During a lull in the fighting, the American and Filipino forces improved their defensive positions by digging trenches and dugouts and by laying mines. The lack of sufficient food and the ever-present diseases, however, were their greatest concern and took a greater toll on the defenders than did the enemy. By March, what little quinine there was had been used up, and the number of malaria cases rose dramatically. In mid-March, over 3,000 men were hospitalized. By the end of the month, between 70 and 80% of the troops were ill. Meanwhile, Homer planned to renew the offensive, but his own troops were not immune to the same problems affecting the defenders. Between January 1st and March 31st, 13,000 Japanese troops were treated for a variety of tropical illnesses. Fortunately for Homer, the latest group of reinforcements, though not the number or quality he desired, had arrived and were welcomed. Because of its strategical position and excellent observation points on its summit, Homer planned to send a force against the Americans' positions on Mount Samat. At the same time, additional forces would advance down the east coast towards Limay. The 4th Division, supported by the 65th Brigade, was designated to lead the attack on Mount Samat. The 21st Division would provide flank cover. The air forces and the artillery battalions were directed to bombard the American line just prior to D-Day, which was set for April 3rd. Good Friday, April 3rd, dawned hot and dry. American observers atop Mount Samat could plainly see the Japanese moving into position. At 9 o'clock, the largest bombardment of the campaign thus far began. In the afternoon, the infantry began to advance. Nara's 65th Brigade sliced into the left side of the 2nd Corps and pushed aside the feeble Filipino resistance easily. It appeared that the preliminary bombardment had accomplished its purpose. Homer had ordered the attack on Mount Samat to commence on the 4th. Parker had no option but to call up his reserves. The Japanese attack was repeated behind another intensive bombardment. The heavy artillery fire stunned the front-line defenders. As a result, the Japanese advance continued relentlessly as the defenders were forced back. Parker hoped to counterattack on Easter Monday, and for that very purpose moved all available units up from reserve. Their immediate objective was to retake the recently lost slopes of Mount Samat. Constant Japanese pressure, however, foiled any chance for an effective counterstroke. The 2nd Corps now found itself in a precarious position. The enemy had captured Mount Samat and were threatening to turn eastward into the Corps' flank. As Louis Morton has written, the story of the last 2 days of the defense of Batan is one of progressive disintegration and final collapse. Lines were formed and abandoned before they could be fully occupied. Communications broke down, and higher headquarters often did not know the situation on the front lines. Orders were issued and revoked because they were impossible of execution. Stragglers poured to the rear in increasingly large numbers until they clogged all roads and disrupted all movement forward. Units disappeared into the jungle, never to be heard from again. In 2 days, an army evaporated into thin air. On the east coast, the story was the same. The 26th Cavalry attempted to halt the Japanese advance, but to no avail. Wainwright was besieged with nothing but reports of retreat. Admiral King, although under orders from Wainwright not to surrender, knew that further resistance was suicidal. Food was virtually exhausted, and the troops were barely able to continue. Therefore, King took it upon himself to surrender his forces. At 3:30 on April 9th, he sent 2 staff officers under a flag to make contact with the Japanese commander. Unfortunately, King was not to meet with Homer. Instead, he met with the general's representative, Colonel Nakayama. King was in a difficult position, for Nakayama demonstrated an obvious contempt for the American. Nakayama thought that King was actually Wainwright, there to surrender all of the Philippines. The American commander had all he could do to convince the Japanese that he was simply the commander of the forces on Batan, and as such was only empowered to surrender that area. Nakayama was visibly annoyed and refused to listen to any terms King proposed, particularly those regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. King did all he could, but was unable to secure a pledge from the Japanese that all prisoners would be well treated. Homer had already made plans for the disposition of prisoners. He intended to stick closely to the guidelines of the Geneva Convention regarding the conduct toward prisoners of war, even though he was not obliged to, since Japan was not a signer of the treaty. Nevertheless, Homer wanted the prisoners treated properly. As early as March, a few weeks prior to the April 3rd offensive, he had held a conference during which he broached the subject of future prisoners of war. Homer felt the need to evacuate all prisoners as quickly as possible so that his own forces could concentrate on the campaign. He therefore assigned 5 officers the task of planning for the movement of prisoners. On March 23rd, the 5 officers completed their plans and submitted them to Homer. They were relatively simple in concept. The chore of handling the prisoners of war was divided into 2 phases, the first covering the assembling of all the captives, the second the actual journey to the prison camp. Balanga, in the east of the Batan Peninsula, was selected as the assembly point for all prisoners of war. From there, they were to proceed to their final destination. For the first phase of the operation, no provision was made for transportation, since the distance to be travelled was relatively short, the longest being 25 miles. The Japanese army did not pamper its own soldiers in any manner. Vehicles and fuel were far too precious commodities to waste on men capable of walking. The Japanese soldier was therefore accustomed to marching. It was a daily routine during his training. Thus, the relatively short distances the prisoners would have to walk to Balanga were not considered excessive by Japanese standards. At any rate, the prisoners of war would have little choice in the matter. Balanga was the food depot. If they wanted to eat, the prisoners would have to walk to the source of food. Colonel Takatsu was assigned to command the first phase of the operation, General Kawane the second. It was the latter's job to feed the prisoners, care for the sick and wounded, and provide transportation to the permanent prisoner of war camp. Caruana planned to provide the same quality and quantity of food to the prisoners as was issued to his own troops. In anticipation of the imminent fall of Batan, he designated 4 towns along the proposed route and assembled rations there. The first of these towns was Balanga. From there it was 65 miles to the final destination. En route, the prisoners of war would pass through Arani and proceed along Route 7 to Lubao in central Luzon, where once more they would be fed. The final leg of the journey was to San Fernando, where the prisoners would receive their final meal before reaching the internment area, Camp O'Donnell, a short train ride further north. Caruana also planned to establish field hospitals along the way to care for the sick and wounded. Ideally, it was hoped that all prisoners could be transported in vehicles, but given the fact that the Japanese army was not overly mechanized, it was expected that large numbers of prisoners would have to march. But Caruana felt there would be sufficient food to provide for the marchers. This, then, was the plan submitted to Homer and the one he accepted. The general added an order of his own stating that all captives were to be treated with a friendly spirit. Tragically, neither the plan nor Homer's order were carried out, resulting in the horror known as the Batan Death March. A number of fatal errors turned the march into one of World War II's greatest atrocities. The 2 phases of the march were under the command of 2 different officers. No one person was responsible for coordinating the entire operation. There was also a fatal miscalculation regarding the number of prisoners that had to be accommodated. The Japanese estimated the potential number of prisoners to be somewhere between 25 and 45,000, and never dreamed that the actual total would exceed 75,000. They compounded their error by underestimating the physical condition of the defenders of Batan. The Japanese labored under the misconception that the enemy was adequately fed and in decent health. Another serious miscalculation on the part of the Japanese was the length of time the defenders would hold out after the launching of the April 3rd offensive. When the surrender came far sooner than expected, Colonel Takatsu and General Caruana found themselves unprepared to deal with the prisoners. The fall of Batan 1 week after the offensive took them completely by surprise. They were then faced with double the number of prisoners anticipated, and these were underfed and ill. The preparations for accommodating the prisoners were incomplete. Since Homer's offensive was considered secondary to the primary Japanese objectives in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the general was given a low priority in troops, supplies, and equipment. He had barely enough transportation and supplies to accommodate his own troops, let alone a horde of the enemy. Food and medical supplies were in short supply, and many Japanese soldiers died needlessly for lack of proper medical attention. Thousands were suffering from malaria and a wide variety of other tropical diseases. Suddenly responsible for over 80,000 Filipino and American troops, the Japanese found their resources overstretched. For days after Admiral King's surrender, the prisoners poured into Balanga. Some, the fortunate ones, came by truck, but for the most part they were on foot. Along the path to Balanga, no food was available. After all, why should it be? The longest one might have to travel was 25 miles. That was not an impossible task, of course, if one were healthy. Because of the poor state of the prisoners, however, the journey to Balanga was a horror. It took some groups over 2 days to make the journey. Food, and especially water, became an obsession. The first phase of the march thus proved a complete failure. It was totally disorganized, uncoordinated, inadequately supervised, and excessively brutal as the merciless Japanese soldiers vented their vengeance and hatred on their captives. They viewed the prisoners of war as something less than human and treated them as such. Thousands of individual horror stories can be recounted. The brutal behavior seemed arbitrary, almost at the whim of the group leader. Some Japanese were relatively kind to the captives, but many others were just the opposite. Slowly, the prisoners of war made their painful way to Balanga. Once the prisoners reached Balanga, the second phase of the Japanese plan was scheduled to commence. Transportation was supposedly to be available for at least 1/4 of the prisoners of war. The remainder were expected to walk, but with rest stops along the route. Unfortunately, like Phase 1, this part of the plan also proved a failure. The result was the Batan Death March. As the prisoners assembled at Balanga, the area quickly became a cesspool of filth. During the subsequent march, brutality was the rule of thumb. Occasionally, a compassionate guard mitigated the tragedy, but cruelty seemed to be the order of the day. By the time the horrible event was over, nearly 650 Americans and almost 10,000 Filipinos had perished needlessly. When Americans found out about the death march nearly 2 years later, they viewed it as a deliberate Japanese policy of torture and murder. In reality, however, the death march was not an organized policy, nor was it consciously and maliciously directed. It was, rather, the confused result of a tragic combination of circumstances, attitudes, and events. The majority of the atrocities were perpetuated by relatively junior officers or private soldiers, not by the senior commanders. The causes of the death march can be broken down into 5 major categories: the deteriorated physical condition of the captives, the total Japanese unpreparedness to care for so many prisoners in such poor condition, the cultural background of the Japanese soldier who, during training, was taught to be cruel particularly to those no longer worthy to be treated as human, that is, prisoners, the desire for revenge, and finally, the failure of the Japanese leadership to adequately supervise and restrain the hostility toward the prisoners. Thus, the death march occurred. While the death march was in progress, Homer was preoccupied with the critical task of capturing Corregidor and eliminating the enemy forces in the outer islands, most notably at Cebu and Mindanao. Corregidor was the most important objective, for without it, Manila Bay was virtually useless to the Japanese. Corregidor possessed many characteristics similar to a medieval castle. A 2-mile strip of sea formed a moat. The island contained solid defences and was honeycombed by a labyrinth of tunnels. The defenders gave it the nickname the Rock, for it appeared that its defences were as hard as rock. The Rock had been a target of Japanese air forces from late December onward. By mid-January, the top of the island was in ruins. By April, the 15,000 inhabitants were subjected to the full might of the Japanese bombardment. Then, with Batan's fall, the punishment intensified as Japanese artillery was positioned on the southern tip of the peninsula. Eyewitnesses described the horror of the deadly bombardment, noting that by midday the island was totally ablaze. The shock of the bombardment made the island tremble. The concussion from the explosions caused many people to suffer ear and nose hemorrhages. On the evening of May 5th, the main Japanese attack began. The core of resistance on Corregidor was Malinta Tunnel, and Homer was well aware of this. As the landing barges moved across the narrow strip of water, a sharp current swept them toward the eastern end of the island. A bright moon helped the defenders to see the Japanese. The invaders suffered heavy casualties. One unit, however, under Colonel Sato, did manage to land successfully, and after regrouping began to advance on Malinta Tunnel. Back at his headquarters, Homer was unaware of Sato's feat and was apprehensive, believing that the attack was failing. At that very moment, though, Sato's forces were systematically advancing on Malinta. Around 22:30 on May 6th, with the enemy perilously close to Malinta, Wainwright saw no option but to surrender. The many sick and wounded, the horrid stale air of the tunnel coupled with the rapidly deteriorating military situation, convinced him that further gore was senseless. He therefore ordered a white flag run up to the top of the highest flagpole. Along with 2 fellow officers, Wainwright made his way to the Japanese lines on Denver Hill near the entrance of Malinta Tunnel. The first Japanese officer they met was a lieutenant who passed the Americans on to a colonel. Wainwright insisted on surrendering only to Homer, however. Eventually, the Japanese colonel called for a landing barge and took Wainwright over to Batan. There, he was escorted to a White House to await Homer's arrival. Even though he spoke perfect English, Homer insisted on speaking through an interpreter. He had the latter explain to the Americans that he was not prepared to consider any surrender that did not include all the forces in the Philippines. This included those troops still holding out in Mindanao under General Sharp. Wainwright responded that he was only responsible for those troops on Corregidor itself. Homer was suspicious of Wainwright's answer, and knowing the command structure, told the American general that in that case, hostilities would continue until the Americans were ready to accept his terms. With that, Homer rose from the table. Wainwright was in a bind. If he refused to surrender according to Homer's terms, hostilities would continue and probably result in a massacre. Consequently, he took the only road open. The general surrendered in the name of all Allied forces fighting in the Philippines, including those of General Sharp. Corregidor had fallen, and with it, the Philippines. Sharp, however, ignored the surrender order and held out for 3 more days. After that, he too had no option but to surrender as well. But some Americans were not so eager to surrender. They melted away into the jungle where they joined up with Filipino guerrilla bands who harassed the Japanese right up until the time of liberation. General Wainwright took some consolation from a message received only a few hours before he had gone forward to surrender. President Roosevelt said, "In spite of all the handicaps of complete isolation, lack of food and ammunition, you have given the world a shining example of patriotic fortitude and self-sacrifice. The American people ask no finer example of tenacity, resourcefulness, and steadfast courage. The calm determination of your personal leadership in a desperate situation sets a standard of duty for our soldiers throughout the world." With his forces surrendered, Wainwright now faced more than 3 years of harsh captivity. With the conquest of the Philippines, the Japanese gained one of the finest harbors in the Orient and excellent bases from which to stage and supply their garrisons to the south and east, in addition to a large population to contribute to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They had driven the United States from its Far East stronghold, destroyed a combined American and Philippine army, and forced the Far East Air Force and the Asiatic Fleet back to the line of the Malay Barrier. In Japanese hands, the Philippines constituted a formidable barrier to any Allied thrust from the east, aimed at severing the line of communications between Japan and the vast wealth of the East Indies. For America, on the other hand, Batan became a symbol of American determination to return and right the wrong. That day finally came in October 1944, when General MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte with the combined weight of 2 fleets and thousands of fighting men at his back. We had returned. Once the Japanese steamroller was checked by the naval battles of Midway and the Coral Sea, the latter forestalling the invasion of Port Moresby, New Guinea, American planners began casting about for ways to strike back and begin paving the long road to eventual victory and Japan itself. They were aided in their quest by Japan's seizure of the island of Tulagi in the Lower Solomons. The Japanese constructed a seaplane base in the area from which they planned to observe and harass the Allied supply line between Australia and Hawaii. After establishing the base, the Imperial High Command concluded that the Allied communications line was vulnerable to attack by aircraft stationed in the Lower Solomons. They therefore directed the Tulagi garrison to occupy the neighbouring island of Guadalcanal. This island was ideal for the construction of an airbase from which to launch attacks against Allied convoys en route to Australia. The location of the 2 islands also made them ideal staging areas for a projected invasion of Australia. In Washington, meantime, debate raged regarding the first retaliatory step against Japan. General MacArthur, whose headquarters were in Australia, proposed an immediate operation aimed at the seizure of Rabaul, the great enemy naval base on the island of New Britain in the Bismarcks. Admiral King reviewed MacArthur's plan and concluded that it was far too ambitious. Because of its significance, Rabaul was too heavily defended. Logistically, an attack on Rabaul from bases in Australia and New Guinea would be next to impossible. Besides, King said, any amphibious attack in the South Pacific would have to be a naval one, and he was vehemently opposed to MacArthur commanding naval forces. Instead, the Navy countered with a proposal of its own calling for an indirect approach to Rabaul via the Eastern Solomons, where it was felt the Japanese were weaker. A naval officer under Nimitz, not MacArthur, would command the attack. Quite naturally, General Marshall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, supported MacArthur. The Pacific Command in 1942 was a complicated one. The Joint Chiefs had divided the theatre into 2 spheres. The Southwest Pacific Command under MacArthur encompassed everything west of longitude 159 degrees. East of that line was Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area. The Admiral's area was so vast that he split his command in 3, the Central Pacific, North Pacific, and South Pacific areas. Of the 3, the last was potentially the most active. Therefore, Nimitz appointed Admiral Robert Gormley to act as his deputy and command the South Pacific. Nimitz retained the other commands himself. As the debate raged about the merits of the opposing army and navy views, King grew impatient. He took the bull by the horns and ordered Nimitz to make plans for the seizure of Tulagi, even though it was west of the 159-degree boundary, thus placing it in MacArthur's operational area. On June 25th, the plan was ready, and King presented it to the Joint Chiefs. Having already promised MacArthur the command, Marshall found himself in a bind. It was MacArthur himself who tipped the scales in favor of the Navy. He backed down from his direct approach plan and accepted the indirect approach to Rabaul which King's planners had submitted. But MacArthur did not agree to relinquish the command. The controversy over command reached a climax on June 29th, when King and Marshall met face to face. At this meeting, a compromise was reached. 3 objectives were adopted for the overall Pacific strategy. The first involved an attack on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. The other 2 tasks, to be commanded by MacArthur, included the capture of the Western Solomons, Eastern New Guinea, and the Bismarcks that would include the seizure of Rabaul. As a result of the compromise, the southwest Pacific boundary was shifted westward, thus placing Guadalcanal and Tulagi in Nimitz's sphere. MacArthur could no longer claim that he should command all naval forces in that area, since the objective no longer lay there. Instead, Vice Admiral Gormley, Nimitz's deputy, would be responsible for the operation. On July 4th, Nimitz and King met in San Francisco to discuss the forthcoming attack. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner was also present at this meeting. Turner, fresh from the war plans staff, was slated to command the amphibious phase of the operation. On the 5th, it was learned that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. This news emphasized the need to accelerate the Solomons attack if the line of communication between Hawaii and Australia was to be protected. Thus, Operation Watchtower, the attack on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, took shape. The attack was scheduled for August 1st. Turner assumed command on July 18th, just 2 weeks prior to the projected date of the first American amphibious operation of the war. His first problem was assembling a staff. Hardly any of the officers selected by the Bureau of Navigation had any amphibious training whatsoever. Therefore, Turner would have to rely on the amphibious-oriented Marines. General Alexander Vandergrift's 1st Marine Division was chosen to make the attack. Turner's plan called for the capture of Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and a few smaller islands in the area. The importance of Guadalcanal increased daily as construction of the Japanese airfield progressed. Turner knew that it would be virtually impossible to meet the August 1st target date. There was simply not enough time to assemble the necessary shipping and to train the troops. King agreed to a week's postponement and established the new target date of August 7th. Any further delay and the enemy airfield would be completed and operational. Turner's amphibious force was officially designated Task Force 62. For his flagship, the Admiral commandeered the merchant ship Macaulay. Though this ship was deemed adequate for his needs, subsequent experience proved that the Macaulay lacked too many essentials for the successful conduct of a large-scale amphibious operation. After leaving Auckland, New Zealand, Task Force 62 headed for Fiji, where it was scheduled to undergo a dress rehearsal for the invasion. En route, Turner and his staff composed an 87-page plan by which the operation would be governed. On Sunday, July 26th, Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, commander of the American carrier force slated to protect the operation, held a conference aboard his flagship, the carrier Saratoga. Fletcher announced that his 3 carriers, Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise, along with their escorting warships, would remain in the area for only 2 days in support of the landings. After that, the amphibious forces would be on their own. Fear of enemy attacks on his precious carriers dominated Fletcher's thinking. He had already lost 2 carriers, Lexington in the Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway. Turner's Chief of Staff, Captain Peyton, recalls the conference as a very stormy one. Fletcher, he said, criticized the operational plan, saying that it was put together too hastily and therefore not thoroughly planned. Enraged, Turner shot back, condemning Fletcher's decision to pull the carriers out after 48 hours. Admiral Gormley was not present at the meeting. Instead, he was represented by his Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan. If Gormley had been present, Turner felt that he would have sided with him and ordered Fletcher to remain in the vicinity longer. In his view, then, the conference was less than satisfactory. Fletcher could not be dissuaded. Turner turned his attention to the all-important rehearsal scheduled for the 28th through the 31st. The dress rehearsal proved totally inadequate. Coro Island in the Fijis lacked the proper beach conditions and proved hazardous to boats, the very landing craft that Turner could ill afford to risk because of the critical shortage. As a result, only one-third of the Marines who needed the benefit of a rehearsal for the forthcoming attack actually took part in the practice session. Nevertheless, the experience was not totally without value. The gunfire support ships and the supporting aircraft did gain needed experience. General Vandergrift, the Marine commander of the invasion force, complained bitterly that the rehearsal was unsatisfactory. Following the dress rehearsal, Task Force 62 sailed for the Solomons, 1,100 miles away. Careful to maintain radio silence, the force glided around the western side of Guadalcanal and through the 12-mile-wide channel separating the island from the Russell Islands. In no way did Guadalcanal resemble the tropical paradise of travel brochures and storybooks. The Solomons lie a few degrees south of the equator. The climate is wet and hot with an average temperature in the high 80s. The heat and frequent rains make the island a steamy, jungle-covered, pestilential hell. Averaging 25 miles in width, Guadalcanal has a spiny ridge of mountains running through the center. The jagged peaks are covered with a tropical rainforest. Numerous rivers flow from the mountains to the coast on the northern side of the island. With the exception of a handful of coconut plantations, the jungle grew right down to the water's edge. The occasional grassy open ground was covered with kunai grass, taller than a man and sharp as a razor. The foul, smelly swamps and humid jungles abound with huge insects, lizards, and snakes. At the mouths of the rivers, crocodiles lived. The most dangerous inhabitants were the large mosquitoes. These insects infected the invading Americans and Japanese alike with dengue, malaria, and numerous other tropical diseases. In addition, the tropical humidity caused numerous and frequent fungus infections. The weather on the morning of the attack was all that an invading force could ask for. After passing Cape Esperance on the northeast corner of Guadalcanal, the American force split up. The lead transports, Group Yoke, headed north of Savo Island toward Florida Island, the larger of the two forces. Group X-Ray made for Lunga Point on Guadalcanal. The first sight of Guadalcanal inspired Marine correspondent H.L. Maryland to comment, "Guadalcanal is an island of striking beauty. Blue-green mountains, towering into a brilliant tropical sky or crowned with cloud masses, dominate the island. The dark green of jungle growth blends into the softer greens and browns of coconut groves and grassy plains and ridges. Despite a week's softening-up bombing by B-17 bombers from Espiritu Santo, the Japanese did not appear to be anticipating an invasion. Immediately after dawn on D-Day, planes from the American carriers began hitting targets on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Guadalcanal. Cruisers and destroyers lobbed shells into suspected Japanese positions. 18 enemy seaplanes were caught like sitting ducks in Tulagi's harbor and were destroyed at their moorings. At 8 o'clock, the 1st Raider Battalion hit Tulagi's beaches, supported by the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. In just over an hour, 1,000 Marines were ashore. On Tulagi, the Marines got their first taste of the Japanese defensive strategy that was encountered all too frequently on other islands later on. The defenders held up in caves that provided immunity from aerial and naval bombardment. Only the direct hit at the mouth of the cave was effective. The attackers moved quickly inland and began to task of clearing the island. The 2nd Battalion moved towards the northeastern part of the island and encountered little resistance. By the end of the day, the entire northern portion of Tulagi was secured. Meanwhile, the raiders had driven across the island and cut it in two. When they pivoted and began advancing southeast, however, Japanese resistance increased dramatically, and the attack slowed to a crawl. Using grenades and explosive charges, the Marines concentrated on clearing the enemy dugouts and bunkers, but progress was slow. It was obvious that Tulagi could not be secured in one day. As night began to fall, the raiders set up a defensive perimeter. The 2nd Battalion moved down from the other end of the island and settled into line alongside their comrades. During the night, the Japanese wasted the bulk of their manpower attempting to storm the American positions. The line held. The following morning, the Marines advanced against the few remaining enemy positions. By 15 o'clock, the entire island was in American hands. The Japanese lost about 500 men on Tulagi. A handful escaped by swimming to nearby Florida Island, but only 3 surrendered. American casualties were 36 dead and 54 wounded. Because of the shortage of landing craft, the D-Day landings on the twin islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo were scheduled for 12 o'clock. The 350 defenders of these 2 islands, connected by a causeway, put up a bitter defense. The American plan called for this objective to be overrun in 1 day, but with the enemy holed up in caves and strong bunkers, the task proved impossible. The Marines were compelled to reinforce the original landing force. Gavutu and Tanambogo were not secured until 21 on August 9th, D+2. In contrast to Tulagi, American casualties were relatively heavy on the Twin Islands, with 108 dead and 140 wounded. On the primary objective, Guadalcanal, the Marines hit the beach at 9:10 on August 7th. The landing point Red Beach was located about a mile east of Lunga Point. The attackers expected a hostile reception and were amazed when not one Japanese was found. The 1st Marines, landing in the second wave, moved quickly inland and established a defensive perimeter. Meanwhile, the 5th Marines advanced along the coast towards the Ilu River. The Marines stumbled across Japanese barracks and camps with food still on the table, abandoned in haste by the surprised Japanese who fled into the jungle. By nightfall, the American perimeter was 3,500 yards deep. 1 battalion reached the Ilu and dug in for the night. Not a shot was fired in anger that first day. The quiet was ominous. Thanks to the lack of enemy interference, while the Marines moved steadily inland, tons of supplies were deposited on the beaches. The main landing area became so congested that Vandergrift was forced to establish another one, known as Red Beach Extension, a few hundred yards nearer Lunga Point. By nightfall, over 1,100 Marines were ashore along with their artillery and equipment. Huge piles of supplies sat on the beaches, and landing craft hovered offshore waiting to be unloaded. It did not take the Japanese long to wake up. At the mighty base in Rabaul, a flight of bombers was being readied for an attack on Milne Bay, New Guinea. When word of the American landings was broadcast by a radio operator on Tulagi, the pilots were ordered to change their targets and roared off toward Guadalcanal. On Bougainville, Coast Watcher Paul Mason spotted the Japanese formation heading down the slot and got off a hasty radio message to Pearl Harbor. Word of the sighting was immediately passed to Turner on the Macaulay. Turner ordered the landing craft off the beaches. The invasion fleet moved out into open water so that it would have room to maneuver during the air raid. When the 24 enemy bombers, escorted by Zero fighters, arrived over the beachhead, Wildcat fighters from the Enterprise were waiting for them. The Wildcats and anti-aircraft fire from the escorting warships accounted for 23 of the 24 bombers. 11 Wildcats were shot down by the Zeros. The only bomb damage sustained was to the destroyer Mugford. 3 precious hours of unloading time, however, was lost. No saga of Guadalcanal can be complete without mention of the contribution made by the Coast Watchers. When the British colonialists evacuated the Solomons in the face of the Japanese invasion, a handful of men, mostly Australian and New Zealander plantation overseers or workers, elected to remain behind and join the natives in offering whatever resistance they could to the invaders. These men established observation posts overlooking the slot and monitored Japanese ship and plane movements. This information was passed by radio to Allied receiving stations. It was a hazardous occupation at best. Constantly hunted and pursued by the Japanese, the Coast Watchers were forever on the move, forced to establish new observation posts. Many of them were eventually captured. Countless American soldiers, Marines, and sailors owe their lives to the dedication and bravery of this handful of men. As for the natives, they too were hostile to the foreign invaders. Instead of treating them decently, the Japanese tortured and enslaved the inhabitants of the Solomons, who consequently took advantage of every opportunity to strike back. Lone Japanese and small patrols were ambushed in the jungles and annihilated. Many of those who abandoned their breakfast on the morning of August 7th and beat a hasty retreat into the jungle met with this fate. No one will ever know just how many Japanese were annihilated by the natives on Guadalcanal during the 6-month-long struggle. On the other hand, the British had treated the natives rather well. Therefore, when the white-faced Americans invaded the Japanese-held islands, the Solomon Islanders were more than willing to assist in whatever manner they could. On the morning of Day 1, the 5th Marines continued their advance towards Lunga Point. One battalion crossed the Lunga River, reached the west coast of the point, and established a defensive perimeter around Kukum. At 16, another battalion reached the main objective, the nearly completed airfield, and found it completely deserted. The airfield was christened Henderson Field in honor of Major Loffen Henderson, a Marine pilot annihilated during the Battle of Midway. During the advance, the Marines at Lunga Point ran into their first hostile fire. Enemy resistance was sporadic, however, and failed to slow the advance. By the end of the second day, the Marines had captured Kukum, secured Lunga Point, the airstrip, and held a large perimeter. Because of the small number of troops available, the American line was not continuous. Large gaps separated the Marine units. Another air raid during the day resulted in the torpedoing of the destroyer Jarvis. A blazing Japanese bomber crashed into the transport George F. Elliott, setting it on fire. The transport continued to blaze offshore for hours. Air raid alarms, false or real, played havoc with the unloading operation. At each alarm, the transports were forced to weigh anchor and make for safer waters. Precious time was lost, and since Fletcher would not be dissuaded from his 48-hour promise, this lost time proved critical. That night, the Emperor's admirals struck back. A force of cruisers and destroyers under Admiral Mikawa left Rabaul shortly after the first reports of the American landings. By late evening, the Japanese squadron was approaching the waters around Guadalcanal. Admiral Turner had positioned 3 patrols of warships to guard the transports off Lunga Point. Between Savo Island and Tulagi was a northern force consisting of the cruisers Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes. A southern force made up of the cruiser Chicago and the Australian cruisers. Australia and Canberra patrolled back and forth between Savo and Guadalcanal. Both forces were under the tactical command of Rear Admiral Crutchley, Royal Australian Navy. A southern force containing the cruisers San Juan and the Australian Hobart watched the other end of the sound. Around 1 o'clock on the 9th, Mikawa's forces entered the waters between Savo and Guadalcanal. 2 hours earlier, Turner had summoned Crutchley to a conference aboard the Macaulay. Thus, the Australia was not present when the Japanese opened up on the Allied force with torpedoes and gunfire at 1:36. Canberra quickly took 2 torpedoes and over 2 dozen shell hits. Within minutes, the cruiser was a burning, drifting hulk with a large portion of her crew dead or wounded. Another Japanese torpedo blew the bow off Chicago, and the cruiser drifted out of control and out of the battle. Mikawa then ordered a 90-degree turn to port and pointed his ships towards the northern force. Incredibly, events had happened so fast that no one in the southern force thought to get off a report that they were engaged with the enemy. Thus, the 3 unsuspecting ships of the northern force were taken completely by surprise. At 1:50, the Japanese ships opened fire again. The 3 American cruisers were quickly smothered in a hail of gunfire and torpedoes. The Quincy sank at 2:35, Vincennes 15 minutes later. Astoria lasted until the following noon before slipping beneath the waves. The burnt-out hulk of the Canberra was scuttled by her crew around 8 o'clock, part 3. The destruction of both Allied naval patrols left the helpless transports at the mercy of Mikawa's warships. Unbelievably, the admiral failed to follow up his victory. Satisfied that he had achieved a great victory, and indeed he had, Mikawa headed back up the slot. The primary objective, the helpless transports, were left unscathed. Throughout the Solomons campaign, this Japanese trait was in evidence. Almost inevitably, they failed to follow up their successes. Turner's 48 hours were fast running out. Throughout the morning, a frantic last-minute effort was made to land as many men and supplies as possible. At 13:30, the word was passed for the ships to weigh anchor. As the Marines on shore stared in amazement, the invasion fleet moved out to sea, their holds still crammed with ammunition and food. Turner had no choice. Unable to persuade Fletcher to keep the carriers in the vicinity any longer, he simply could not leave the transports at the mercy of the Japanese Air Force and Navy. By the time Turner sailed away, over 10,000 Marines had been put ashore on Guadalcanal with 6,000 more on Tulagi. A 37-day supply of food was available to sustain operations, but without warships, the American rear was completely unprotected. Vandergrift and his men were on their own. The Japanese command responsible for the Solomons was the 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Hyaku Take. At the time of the American invasion, the general was directing the New Guinea campaign from his headquarters at Rabaul. On the 13th of August, Hyakutake was ordered by Imperial headquarters to evict the Americans from Guadalcanal. The only force immediately available was a combat team of the 35th or Kawaguchi Brigade, named for its commander Major General Kawaguchi. This force, the Ichiki Detachment, had originally been slated to occupy Midway, but the disastrous turn of events there found Colonel Ichiki and his troops at Rabaul, awaiting transportation back to Japan. On the 16th, the Ichiki Detachment was loaded aboard 6 destroyers of Admiral Reizo Tanaka's reinforcement force. The force set sail for Guadalcanal. After dark on the 18th, Ichiki and 900 of his men landed safely at Taivu Point, 22 miles east of Lunga. This event marked the first of many Tokyo Express runs bringing reinforcements and supplies down the slot. For his exploits, Tanaka earned the respect of his colleagues and was grudgingly nicknamed Tenacious Tanaka by the Americans. The 19th of August was an active day. An American patrol ambushed a group of Japanese near Coley Point. 32 of the enemy were annihilated in the action. An examination of the bodies revealed documents indicating that fresh troops of Ichikis had just arrived on Guadalcanal. That same day, a raid was carried out against Japanese positions near Matanikau and Kokumbona. 2 companies of Marines traveled overland and attacked Matanikau from the west and south. A 3rd company made an amphibious landing at Kokumbona. This attack yielded little, but during the other attack, 65 Japanese were annihilated. The next day, the escort carrier Long Island sailed to within 200 miles of Guadalcanal. 19 fighters and 12 dive bombers lifted off the carrier's flight deck and landed safely at Henderson Field. Vandergrift's men had worked tirelessly to make the field operational. At the same time, 3 fast transports brought 120 tons of supplies to the island. These ships lingered long enough to ferry the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines over from Tulagi. With their mission accomplished, the swift little ships hightailed it out of range of enemy planes from Rabaul. Although a force of 10,000 Marines seemed formidable, it was in fact barely large enough to form an adequate defensive perimeter around Henderson Field. Even then, the perimeter was not continuous. Vandergrift positioned his troops so as to protect the airstrip from the most obvious avenues of attack. Elsewhere, gaping holes loomed in the American line. The security of Henderson Field, however, was Vandergrift's foremost responsibility. This, coupled with the fact that the prospect of resupply seemed remote, prevented the Marines from taking the offensive. Based on the reports from his patrols and the resident coast watcher, Martin Clemens, and his native scouts, Vandergrift sensed that a Japanese attack was imminent and that it would probably be made by those fresh troops at Taivu. The general ordered his troops to dig in on the bank of the Ilu River. Thanks to the inadequacy of their outdated maps, what the Marines thought was the Tenaru River was actually the Ilu. This fact was not discovered until weeks later. Therefore, the forthcoming battle became known as the Battle of the Tenaru. Although Ichiki Detachment was but the leading element of the Kawaguchi Brigade, the colonel was contemptuous of the Americans and decided to attack without waiting for the Tokyo Express to deliver the rest of the brigade. When the Japanese attack came, the 1st Marines were waiting for it. At the mouth of the Ilu, Tenaru, was a sandpit that formed an ideal ford across the river. There the Marines placed barbed wire and dug in along the west bank of the river. Riflemen and machine gunners waited in foxholes for the impending attack. Just before midnight on the 21st of August, Marine listening posts in the jungle reported large enemy movements. Around 1:30, sporadic Japanese rifle and mortar fire began peppering the Marine lines. A few minutes later, a howling, screeching mob of Ichikis erupted from the jungle. All along the line, the Marines opened up with a withering fire. Grenades and mortars fell in the ranks of the attackers. Anti-tank guns spewed canister shot. The Ichiki ranks were decimated. A few Japanese managed to clamber over the backs of their fallen comrades and reached the Marine lines, where they were beaten back with bayonets and rifle fire, leaving almost 500 dead behind them. If nothing else, Ichiki was determined. For the next few hours, Japanese artillery fire was directed at the Marine positions. Then, around 5 o'clock, the Japanese surged forward again. As Robert Leckie described it, running erect and with no attempt to get below the American fire, the Japanese soldiers were cut down by Marine machine guns. Artillery strikes came whistling and crashing down upon them. Balked by the wire, struck from the side by bullets and from the sky by shells, the Japanese perished almost to a man, falling upon one another until they lay 3 deep in death for the tide to bury them in the morning. Ichiki and his few remaining troops cowered in the jungle, while the Marines continued to pour fire into the position. Then the 1st Battalion of Marines, which had been held in reserve, launched a counterattack into the jungle. Vandergrift sent a company of tanks to reinforce the attack as the right wing of the marine line swung around in a broad arc to the sea. The tanks clanked across the piles of enemy, dead spewing death and destruction until their tracks resembled meat grinders. Over 800 of Ichiki's shock troops lay dead along the banks of the ILU. Many of the survivors were badly wounded and later perished during the retreat. Humiliated, Colonel Ichiki burned his colors and shot himself. Thus, the first Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal ended in total disaster. At the same time, it destroyed the myth of Japanese invincibility as jungle fighters. At the Battle of the Tenaru, the United States Marines clearly demonstrated that they were more than the equal of the vaunted Japanese army. Even while the Marines were finishing off the remnants of Ichiki's command, the Tokyo Express was making ready to transport the rest of Kawaguchi's force to Guadalcanal. Halfway down the slot, Tanaka's force was sighted by reconnaissance patrols from Henderson Field. Using discretion, Tanaka turned around and headed for the Shortlands. Meanwhile, in order to mask Tanaka's movement, Admiral Yamamoto attempted to lure Fletcher's carriers away from Guadalcanal. The effort succeeded since Fletcher's force was far out to sea at any rate, and in poor position to intervene at Guadalcanal. In the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 23rd of August, the Japanese lost the light carrier Ryujo, but the Enterprise was badly damaged. During the Great Carrier Battle, Tanaka's superiors, confident that the American carriers were engaged, directed him to reverse course again. 100 miles north of Guadalcanal, the Japanese ships were attacked by a squadron of Enterprise dive bombers. The Enterprise squadron had been sent to Henderson Field after their ship became inoperable. The Americans hit the cruiser Jintsu, Tanaka's flagship, and wounded the admiral. One transport was also hit and sunk with the loss of many troops. Shortly thereafter, a flight of B-17s from Espiritu Santo arrived. Bombing from a high altitude, they managed to sink 2 of Tanaka's destroyers. The reinforcement effort ended in failure as Tanaka's mangled force limped back to the Shortlands. Nevertheless, tenacious Tanaka was equal to his name. During the last week in August, his destroyers managed to land the rest of Kawaguchi's force at Taivu. Harassed by Henderson's planes, the naval force lost 400 more of Colonel Oka's brigade, but over 6,000 of Kawaguchi's troops were safely put ashore. In the meantime, General Hyakutake received orders from Imperial headquarters directing him to go over to the defensive in New Guinea and concentrate all available resources of the 17th Army on the recapture of Guadalcanal. At the same time, the plight of the stranded Marines on the island caused President Roosevelt to prepare for the worst, so that the announcement of a defeat in the Solomons would not come as a shock to the nation. In a Labor Day address, Roosevelt said, "We must not overrate the importance of our successes in the Solomons, though we may be proud of the skill with which these local operations have been conducted." But even though an air of pessimism hung over Gormley's headquarters on Noumea, Vandergrift was not ready to throw in the towel. A battalion of the 5th Marines landed behind Japanese lines near Kokumbona on the night of the 27th of August. After encountering heavy resistance, the Marines drove eastward the following morning and made their way back to the Lunga perimeter. Vital information regarding enemy strength and dispositions were gathered during the raid. The success of the raid bolstered Vandergrift's confidence and caused him to plan another, more ambitious foray. Knowing full well that for 2 weeks the Tokyo Express had been depositing reinforcements at Taivu, the general sent the 1st Raider Battalion under Colonel Red Mike Edson to conduct a raid on Taivu Point itself. Edson was just the type of commander the Marines admired. When asked by one of his troops what could be done about the rapidly dwindling supply of food on the island, Edson replied, "There is lots of chow. The Japanese have it. Take it away from them." Take it away from them they did. Reinforced by the 1st Parachute Battalion, the Marines went ashore at Tasimboko on the morning of the 8th of September. The Japanese, convinced that a major landing was in progress, fled the scene. Edson's troops failed to annihilate many of the enemy, but they uncovered huge quantities of supplies. There was too little time to load the supplies on the transports, so Edson's men jabbed their bayonets into tins of food, while others dragged bags of rice into the surf. Kawaguchi's supply base, including a powerful transmitter, was destroyed. The Marines then re-embarked and sailed back to Lunga Point, their pockets brimming with tins of Japanese meat and bottles of sake, and General Kawaguchi's dress-white uniform flying from the masthead, the same dress uniform that Kawaguchi planned to wear to the American surrender ceremony. While Edson was raiding Kawaguchi's base, the latter's men were hacking their way through the jungle toward Henderson Field. One of Edson's patrols had blundered into the Japanese rear guard and reported their findings. When the raiders arrived back at Lunga, this news was quickly given to Vandergrift, who immediately began to prepare for another full-scale Japanese attack. As previously mentioned, there were not enough Marines on Guadalcanal to allow for a continuous perimeter. All Vandergrift could do was defend the more obvious approaches to Henderson Field. The only continuous line that did exist was along the beaches of Lunga Point, stretching from the ILU to Kukum. From Kukum, the Marine line bent inland in a wide arc for about 2,000 yards. A second line began 1,000 yards up the ILU and continued inland for another 2,500 yards, broken in the middle by a bend in the river. The remaining, the shortest, line was about 3,000 yards directly south of the airfield along a hump-backed bare stretch of land. This 1,500-yard-long line was entrusted to the care of Edson's men and the 1st Raider Parachute Battalion. Meanwhile, Kelly Turner had arrived on Guadalcanal for a meeting with Vandergrift. Turner promised that somehow he would manage to bring the 7th Marines up from Samoa. Unfortunately, the two men could not agree on the best method of utilizing these troops. Turner was extremely fond of playing soldier and wished to have the 7th Marines establish an entirely new perimeter. Vandergrift, on the other hand, wanted to use the reinforcements to defend that territory already in American hands. While the two were conferring, Vandergrift was handed a message from Gormley that in summary stated he could provide nothing further in the way of reinforcements. Too many ships had already been lost, including another carrier. The Marines were being abandoned to their fate. Turner promised to change Gormley's mind. During the 2 nights that Turner stayed on Guadalcanal, the Japanese obliged with their nightly show. Destroyers sailed into Iron Bottom Sound and lobbed shells into the American positions. But instead of bombarding Henderson Field as usual, the firing was directed at Edson's positions on the ridge. 2 unremitting nocturnal visitors also paid their nightly visits. Louis the Louse, a plane that usually managed to drop a bomb or two on the airfield, and Washing Machine Charlie, another plane whose engine seemed out of synchronization, treated Turner to a display of their antics. Usually neither visitor was able to cause much damage except to keep the Marines awake with the bombing and whining drone of their engines. Turner left on the 12th, a few hours before a 40-plane raid arrived from Rabaul. For the loss of 1 aircraft, American pilots shot down 16 of the enemy. Those that did get through dropped 500-pounders and fragmentation grenades on the ridge. More Marines were annihilated and wounded. Around 21 o'clock, Louis the Louse showed up again and dropped a flare. A short time later, 4 Japanese warships offshore opened fire. As Edson's men sought cover once more, Vandergrift knew from what direction the next Japanese attack would come. They were paying too much attention to the positions on the ridge. General Kawaguchi planned a textbook operation calling for a 3-pronged attack. The main body of his troops would attack northward across the ridge, thereby pinning down the bulk of the Americans. At the same time, a second force would attack across the ILU simultaneously with Colonel Oka's attack against the western perimeter. With the main American force pinned down the latter, 2 Japanese forces would break through and capture Henderson Field. The entire operation relied on precise timing and coordination of effort. Oka's force, moving overland from Matanikau, got lost in the jungle and did not arrive in position on time. Nevertheless, Kawaguchi decided to attack as planned. Rabaul had directed him to launch the offensive on the 12th, and with his communications destroyed during the raid on Tasimboko, he could not request a postponement. In addition, not all of this force had reached their assembly point. Many units were still strung out behind in the jungle. Consequently, Kawaguchi had only enough troops available for a probing attack. At 22, on the night of the 12th of September, a horde of Japanese, shrieking banzai and Marine you die, dashed out of the jungle and hit Edson's line head-on. The paratroopers' position was overrun and pushed back. Some units were cut off, but the impetus of the Japanese attack was too swift even for them. Leaderless, they milled around behind the Marine lines until they were driven back with rifles and grenades. On the left of Edson's line, the enemy swarmed over Marine foxholes. Bayonets, swords, and rifle butts flashed in the eerie light of battle, and the Japanese attack broke. Edson called for a counterattack, and by morning all lost territory was regained. Even though the ridge had been held, Edson knew that the Japanese would be back. Kawaguchi was regrouping and wondering why Oka's attack in the west and Ishitari's attack on the ILU had not occurred. Despite the loss of a few hundred men, however, Kawaguchi was supremely confident that the next night would bring victory. Kawaguchi planned for 2 battalions to blow a hole in the American line. Once this was done, a fresh force under Colonel Watanabe would dash through the gap and head directly for the airfield. Around 21:30, the attack surged forward again. The brunt of the attack fell on the parachutists on the right of Edson's line. Despite the rain of artillery and mortar fire and the fearsome canister shot, the Japanese came fanatically on. The Marine line bent and broke. Using grenades, machine guns, and small arms fire, the parachutists eventually restored the line. A short time later, another strong attack struck the raiders on Edson's left. This attack was much stronger and drove the Marines back. Edson called down artillery fire onto the forward positions of the ridge. Screaming Japanese troops dove into American foxholes to escape the hail of death. The Marines stabbed or bludgeoned them to death and hurled the bodies back again. Despite the hail of fire, Kawaguchi's men continued to swarm out of the jungle. Platoon after platoon moved forward. Finally, Edson gave the word to pull back to a shorter line. There the Marines stood their ground as the enemy, climbing over the backs of their dead and dying comrades, broke and ran. 2 weaker attacks were hurled against Edson's troops before Kawaguchi decided to call it quits. Vandergrift then committed his few remaining reserves and drove the enemy back into the jungle. As an effective fighting force, Kawaguchi's brigade no longer existed. While Edson's men were up to their ears in Japanese, Ishitari's battalion finally attacked along the ILU. Attacking across an open field, his men ran headlong into the deadly fire of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Hung up on barbed wire or caught in the open by 75mm howitzers, they were massacred. A second attack suffered the same fate as the first. Only a handful managed to break through. These were easily dealt with. During the height of the battle, one company commander radioed battalion headquarters. "Some Japanese just got inside my barbed wire." After a short pause, he resumed. There were 27 of them. Oka's tardy attack in the west was easily repulsed by the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines later that afternoon. The colonel was not eager to prove that his troops could die just as easily as Kawaguchi's or Ishitari's. Once he realized that there was no chance of breaking through, Oka called off the attack. Kawaguchi now began the humiliating task of withdrawing from the scene of the battle. Because of Edson's earlier raid against his supply base, the general decided to head west and link up with Oka's force-making for Matanikau. Leaving over 700 dead for the Americans to bury, he loaded some 500 wounded on litters and began the trek through the pitiless jungle. En route, most of the wounded died or were left behind to perish by their hunger-weakened comrades. A week later, the starving survivors of Kawaguchi's once proud force stumbled into the Japanese lines at Matanikau. But conditions there were little better. Food was at a premium, and the Japanese felt the pangs of starvation. As for Edson, his losses were only 59 dead and 204 wounded. However, the parachute battalion was decimated and would shortly leave Guadalcanal for good. Red Mike and his Marines had achieved an enormous victory at a relatively light cost. As was their wont, the Marines gave their position an appropriate name: Vicious Ridge. The struggle for Vicious Ridge would go down in Marine Corps annals as one of the Corps' finest moments. More importantly, Henderson Field remained in American hands. The improvement of the airstrip had been ongoing almost from the day the Marines landed. The runway was enlarged and steel matting laid down so that the mud would not hinder takeoffs and landings. With the improvement of the airstrip came Marine fighter squadrons to man the airfield. Thus was born the Cactus Air Force. If the Japanese had failed in their attempts to destroy the Marines, the conditions on Guadalcanal were trying their best to do the job for them. For weeks, the Marines had been subsisting on 2 meals a day, much of those consisting of captured Japanese rice and other provisions. Then there were the diseases. Dysentery, fungus infections, jungle rot and malaria ravaged the troops. Exhaustion and malnutrition joined hands with the torrid humidity to take their toll. William Manchester has written, "The typical Marine on the island ran a fever, wore stinking dungarees, loathed twilight, and wondered whether the United States Navy still existed. He ate mouldy rations and quinine. He alternatively shivered and sweated. If he was bivouacked near Henderson, he spent his mornings filling in craters left by enemy bombers the night before. If he was on his way back to the line, he struggled through shattered, stunted coconut trees, scraggy bushes, and putrescent jungle, clawing up and down slopes ankle-deep in mud, hoping he could catch a few hours of uninterrupted sleep in his foxhole. At dawn on the 18th of September, tearful Marines stared seaward at a welcome sight. Unloading at Lunga Point were transports carrying the 7th Marines. In the next 12 hours, vast quantities of supplies were also brought ashore. Kelly Turner had kept his word to Vandergrift. Once the decimated parachute battalion was safely on board, the transports hoisted anchor and sailed away. Meanwhile, Vandergrift had been sending patrols into the jungle in an effort to ascertain the enemy's intentions. Once the 7th Marines moved into line, the perimeter was almost continuous. Therefore, Vandergrift began to consider taking the offensive. Flushed with the success of Vicious Ridge and the arrival of reinforcements, the general decided to launch a limited offensive aimed at driving the Japanese away from Henderson Field. One battalion of the 7th Marines, commanded by a colorful character, Major Louis Chesty Puller, moved out to attack enemy positions near Mount Austin while the raiders advanced along the coast in the direction of Matanikau. Neither of the attacks met with much success. Even less successful was an amphibious attack west of Point Cruz by 3 companies of the 7th Marines. This force was ambushed and lost, over 60 men annihilated with 100 wounded. The death toll might have been much higher were it not for the guns of the destroyer Ballard. Firing from as close inshore as it dared to stray, the destroyer covered the Marines' evacuation and carried them back to Lunga Point. In the first week of October, Vandergrift decided to have another go at the enemy concentration near Matanikau. Elements of the 7th Marines would cross the river upstream and attack the Japanese from the south. At the same time, the 5th Marines would launch an attack at the mouth of the river. On the 9th, the 7th crossed the river and turned 90 degrees toward the coast. At that point, one of the most successful and vicious actions of the entire campaign occurred. Puller's 1st Battalion stumbled upon the Japanese 4th Regiment, taking cover in a ravine. What followed next was almost like a comic opera, but with far deadlier results. Puller called down artillery fire into the ravine. The Japanese swarmed out of the open end of the ravine directly into the sights of Marine rifles and machine guns. The Japanese ran back and sought refuge in the ravine. More artillery fire drove them quickly out once more. The action continued until the Marines began to run low on ammunition. With this, Puller called his troops off and withdrew, leaving over 700 dead Japanese behind. Meanwhile, the other attackers managed to trap a small detachment of the enemy between them, near the mouth of the Matanikau. The Japanese attempted to flee eastward. 60 of them perished in hand-to-hand fighting with the raiders. Others died trying to cross the river. Unfortunately, even though the operation was a success, the Marines were forced to abandon some of the hard-earned territory. Vandergrift's intelligence people estimated it was just a matter of time before another strong Japanese effort to take Henderson Field. For weeks, the Tokyo Express had been landing men and supplies on the island. There could only be one reason for the build-up, another major offensive. But Vandergrift was not about to concede all of the captured territory. For too many weeks, the Marines had been confined to the perimeter on Lunga Point, while Vandergrift waited for the opportunity to extend his lines. Now, with his command reinforced by the 7th Marines and the leading elements of the Army's Americal Division on their way up from the South Pacific, the Marines pulled back only as far as the east bank of the Matanikau. There, a strong defensive line was formed. Lack of adequate manpower prevented the line from being anchored to the Lunga line. However, the Matanikau perimeter was linked to Lunga by a series of outposts. The action was indeed heating up. The next few weeks would make the difference between victory and defeat. Both sides continued to pour in reinforcements. General Hyakutake himself arrived on Guadalcanal to take personal command. Imperial headquarters fed a steady stream of reinforcements to staging areas at Rabaul and the Shortlands. From there, they were ferried down the slot by the Tokyo Express. One of the formations dispatched to Guadalcanal was the vaunted Sendai Division, veterans of campaigns in China, Manchuria, and Java. Hyakutake gave the Sendai's commander, General Maruyama, responsibility for coordination of the offensive and the recapture of Henderson Field. Maruyama was a haughty man who was openly contemptuous of his predecessor's failure. Maruyama arrived on Guadalcanal radiating confidence. His battle plan called for another dual attack. A force under Major General Sumiyoshi was to attack across the mouth of the Matanikau, in conjunction with an attack against that line from the south by another force under Colonel Oka. The latter was to cross the river upstream and coordinate his efforts with Sumiyoshi. At the same time, Maruyama's main body, consisting of the bulk of the Sendai Division and another force under the hapless Kawaguchi, would attack the Marine positions south of Henderson Field, near Vicious Ridge. To accomplish this, the Sendai would have to make a forced march through the jungle, but Maruyama did not consider this a problem for his superbly trained troops. The general ordered his advance formations to hack out a trail through the undergrowth and called it the Maruyama Trail. Thus, Maruyama was determined to repeat 2 mistakes of his predecessors from the start, that is, a long forced march through the jungle by a large body of troops, and reliance on a complicated plan of battle requiring precise timing and coordination. A third mistake was destined to be repeated during the battle itself. Never in his wildest imagination did Maruyama anticipate the difficulties of moving so many troops through 35 miles of thick, tangled jungle. Pelted daily by heavy rains, the Japanese formation struggled along the slippery trail. The muddy track was soon littered with shells, heavy machine guns, mortars, and other heavy equipment discarded by the exhausted troops. Almost all of the artillery was abandoned and left to rust, since moving them overland proved far too difficult, even for the Sendai. Maruyama soon found himself behind schedule. Originally, he intended to attack on the night of the 23rd of October, in concert with Oka's and Shimeyoshi's attack at Matanikau. But the Sendai were strung out for miles along the trail, and as the time for the scheduled attack rolled around, the Japanese troops were still 5 miles short of their objective. Accordingly, Maruyama radioed headquarters announcing his intention to postpone the attack, but the word was never passed to Shimeyoshi. Just after dark on the 23rd, Shimeyoshi's troops began massing for the attack. Just then, American artillery and mortars opened up on the assembly area on the west bank of the river. Shimeyoshi's troops were blasted. 9 Japanese tanks moved out of the jungle and attempted to cross a sandbar. Only one made it. 8 of the tanks were destroyed by artillery fire immediately. The surviving tank managed to reach the marine lines before it was finished off from the rear. Then the artillery opened up on the assembly area once again. It was a massacre. Morning revealed 650 dead Japanese troops in front of the American lines.